You work hard, you play by the rules, and the system takes care of you. That was the deal. That phrase wasn't printed in the Constitution, but it might as well have been carved into the foundation of mid-20th century American life. Especially for white men in blue-collar jobs. It was more than a promise. It was an identity. In the decades after World War II, the American dream was structured around a relatively simple premise: dignity in exchange for labor. You didn't need a college degree to thrive. You didn't need to start your own company. You didn't need to be exceptional. You just needed to show up on time every day and give an honest effort. In return, you'd be able to afford a home, support a family, and retire with security. That social contract was upheld not by benevolence, but by organized labor. A union card wasn't just a paycheck enhancer. It was a power multiplier. It meant collective bargaining. It meant a grievance process. It meant pensions, weekends, overtime pay, health coverage, and the ability to say no without getting fired on the spot. Unions fought for protections that would become standard across the economy, even for non-union workers. But that era, what the economists call the Great Compression, when income inequality was at its lowest, was an historical exception, not a permanent state. And starting in the late 1970s, that deal began to fall apart. Not by accident, not by entropy, by design. The decline of unions was not the side effect of modernization. It was the objective of a political and economic realignment. Deregulation, globalization, financialization. These were the tools of the transformation, and labor was its first target. The air traffic control strike in 1981 marked a turning point. When President Reagan fired over 11,000 federal workers for striking, breaking the union with public support, it sent a clear message. Labor could be crushed, even by the government itself. And from here, the floodgates opened. Corporations offshored production to cheap labor markets. Factories shuttered across the Rust Belt. Steel towns and textile hubs and mining communities were hollowed out. Whole regions were left to rot. What was once framed as a strong working class became recast as bloated, lazy, inefficient. Public discourse, shaped by think tanks, media, and corporate interests, began to mock the very idea of organized labor as a relic of the past. The blue-collar worker went from national hero to national scapegoat. The American worker wasn't just told to tighten his belt. He was told that he was the problem. All of this happened under the banner of economic reform. The euphemisms sounded clean: efficiency, flexibility, modernization. In reality, they meant fewer rights, less stability, and more precarity for the average worker. The manufacturing job that once came with a pension was replaced by a non-union gig with no benefits. The family-supporting wage was replaced by stagnation that didn't keep up with inflation. And as the cost of living rose, housing, healthcare, education, the value of labor flatlined. Yet, somehow, productivity kept going up. Workers were doing more with less, but getting less in return. Wealth was being created, but it wasn't being shared. It was being extracted. And when working people needed support the most, the safety net was pulled out from under them. Welfare reform, cuts to public housing, disinvestment in education. The shredding of social programs didn't happen in isolation. They were part of the same ideological shift that undermined labor. Government assistance was rebranded as dependency. Public service became suspect. Even unemployment insurance was cast as a moral failing. The message was clear: you're on your own now. And so, one by one, the pillars of security were dismantled. First, the jobs, then the benefits, then the protections, then the dignity. And when the dust settled, what remained was a fragmented workforce told to compete against one another for crumbs, told that if they couldn't make it in this new economy, It was because they hadn't adapted. But how do you adapt to betrayal? We didn't call it a collapse. We called it progress. We didn't call it abandonment. We called it personal responsibility. And those left behind were told to look in the mirror and ask what they had done wrong, not what had been done to them. This is where the myth of rugged individualism was reloaded and rebranded. No longer a myth of frontier resilience. It became a tool to mask systemic failure, a way to convince the victims of structural decline that the fault lay within themselves. But the truth is simpler. The system changed the rules and blamed the players for losing the game. In the ruins of blue-collar stability, where pensions used to live and unions once had teeth, a new creed began to rise. It didn't come from the shop floors or the union halls. It came from tech startups, Instagram influencers, YouTube grifters, and corporate rebranders. It arrived slick, smiling, caffeinated, and it brought with it a gospel. Grind, hustle, rise, repeat. Suddenly, your value wasn't tied to your role in a larger economic system. It was tied to your ability to monetize yourself. Every moment not spent generating income became wasted time. Leisure became laziness. Rest became weakness. This wasn't just an economic shift. It was a cultural reprogramming. One that told people not just how to work, but how to live. The pitch was seductive. Gig work was sold as liberation. Drive for Uber, deliver DoorDash, rent your couch on Airbnb. Choose your own hours, set your own rates. Be an entrepreneur, even if the app sets the price and takes the cut. You're no longer a worker. You're a partner, a creator, a brand. It sounded empowering. It felt modern. But underneath the freedom slogans was something much older and much more familiar. Exploitation with a fresh coat of paint. Because in practice, freedom meant no job security, no health care, no sick leave, no vacation, no retirement, no unemployment insurance, no union, no grievance process, no protection from being fired, or rather, deactivated, without warning. You were on your own. Not just alone, but atomized, deliberately fragmented so no collective action could form. And you were told this was better. Hustle culture didn't just infiltrate the gig economy. It colonized our psychology. Work wasn't just something you did. It was who you were. You weren't allowed to simply exist. You had to justify your existence through constant output. Side hustles became the new status symbol. Sleep became optional. Burnout became a badge of honor. People began to brag, unironically, about being too busy to eat, about grinding 24/7. The moral logic was clear. If you're not thriving, it's because you didn't hustle hard enough. Poverty wasn't a structural condition. It was a personal failure. Your bank account became a measure of your worth. Your downtime became a moral risk. And in this environment, rest became rebellion. So most people didn't rebel. They just kept grinding. What made hustle culture so insidious is how it borrowed the language of empowerment while delivering none of the substance. You were told you were in control, but platforms controlled the algorithm. Corporations controlled the rates. Landlords controlled the market. The healthcare industry controlled your options. Government abdicated responsibility, and when things went wrong, there was no one to appeal to. No HR department, no union steward, no legal protections. Just a customer service chatbot and a shrug from the app. This wasn't entrepreneurship. It was feudalism with a UX designer. You weren't building your own business. You were renting your time to a faceless platform, operating at the mercy of an invisible code base. And you were doing it without even being called a worker. You were a user, a creator, a flexible solution. In truth, you were just expendable. This is how rugged individualism came back, not as cowboy bravado or homesteader self-sufficiency, but as the neoliberal survival instinct. The world told you no one is coming to save you. And then it sold you a $1,000 online course to help you save yourself. It told you to build your brand, master the algorithm, wake up at 5 a.m. and cold shower your way to success. Read 10 times as many books. Take no days off. Turn your grief into content. Post through pain. And if it didn't work, well, that was on you. You failed, not the system. You didn't hustle hard enough. You didn't pivot fast enough. You didn't want it bad enough. And so millions of people, especially men, conditioned to define themselves by productivity, internalized the failure. They isolated. They shamed themselves. They tried again and again until the hustle broke them. What was marketed as empowerment was, in truth, a way to make desperation look noble. People weren't driving Ubers because they were chasing a dream. They were doing it because the jobs that used to support families no longer existed. They weren't starting Etsy shops because they were passionate about crafts. They were doing it because wages had stagnated and rent had doubled. They weren't freelancing because it was liberating. They were doing it because the only jobs hiring were independent contractor gigs with zero benefits and no future. And through it all, the system kept whispering, "Isn't this better than a boring 9 to 5? Don't you feel free?" But when every hour of your day is spent trying to cobble together enough income to survive, when your worth is measured in clicks and tips and 5-star ratings, you're not free. You're just isolated, exploited, and exhausted. This is the final form of rugged individualism, not a sturdy ethos of self-reliance, but a permission structure for systematic abandonment. It tells the powerful that they owe the rest of us nothing. It tells the struggling that asking for help is weakness. It tells the broken that they are broken by nature, not by policy. It tells everyone that the only moral response to injustice is personal improvement. If you fail, there's an app for that. There's a YouTube guru for that. There's a pill for that. There's a coffin for that. If you're not thriving, it's because you didn't work hard enough. That sentence doesn't appear in any legal code, but it might as well be etched into the American soul. It's the quiet gospel of modern capitalism, the unspoken doctrine whispered into every job interview, every LinkedIn post, every motivational video, every self-help book. It is the poisoned root of hyper-individualism, and its fruit is despair. Because if success is purely the result of effort, then failure must be the result of laziness. And if you're struggling, well, that's on you. You didn't hustle hard enough. You didn't want it bad enough. You didn't manifest it. You didn't optimize your morning routine. You didn't download the right productivity app. You were given freedom, and you failed. Or so the story goes. This is the trap of hyper-individualism. It demands that you take total responsibility for your life without offering you the tools to actually change it. The factory closes. Not your fault. The housing market becomes a speculative casino. Not your fault. Healthcare costs skyrocket. Not your fault. Your town has no public transit, no good schools, no decent jobs. Not your fault. But in a hyper-individualistic culture, you're not allowed to see that. Because we're trained not to think in terms of systems. We're taught to see every failure as personal, every misstep as moral, every hardship as evidence of our own insufficiency. In this worldview, poverty is not the result of policy. It's a character flaw. Unemployment isn't economic, it's laziness. Depression isn't social, it's weakness. And debt isn't structural, it's stupidity. So, when the weight of it all begins to press down, and the bills pile up, the gigs dry out, the exhaustion sets in, most people don't ask, why is the system like this? They ask, what's wrong with me? There's a fine line between self-reliance and self-loathing, and hyper-individualism erases it completely. We live in a society that constantly tells people to be strong, independent, self-made. But we offer them no map, no tools, no margin for error. We don't teach them economic literacy. We don't explain how redlining shaped whole cities. We don't talk about how tax policy rewards capital over labor, how wages have stagnated for decades, how generational wealth compounds inequality. We just hand out slogans. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Mindset is everything. Winners focus on winning. Losers focus on excuses. But slogans don't fix housing shortages. They don't make insulin affordable. They don't bring back pensions, public schools, or union jobs. And so people are left alone, trying to muscle their way through crises that were never meant to be solved at the individual level. They go to therapy and wonder why their anxiety won't go away, never realizing that their financial precarity is a feature of the economy, not a malfunction of their brain chemistry. They read motivational books and fail to manifest success, blaming themselves for not visualizing hard enough, never realizing they're caught in a system designed to extract, not uplift. Hyper-individualism doesn't just punish the struggling, it prevents the struggling from organizing. Because if you believe your pain is your fault, why would you look for others to feel the same way? Why would you unionize, protest, vote, or build coalitions if your only diagnosis is personal inadequacy? It's not an accident that the ideology of hyper-individualism grew louder, just as inequality exploded. When neoliberalism dismantled public goods and sold off collective power, it replaced it with the myth of the empowered individual. And that myth works because it keeps people from recognizing their shared interests. 1,000 isolated workers blaming themselves will never challenge the boss. 1 million overworked Americans blaming their poor choices won't demand health care as a right. A nation of exhausted individuals striving for personal perfection won't organize to fix what's broken. That's the brilliance of it. It makes power invisible. It makes injustice feel personal. It makes despair feel earned. Eventually, the effort to fix yourself becomes its own kind of cage. You try productivity hacks. You cut lattes. You start a side hustle. You try intermittent fasting. You delete TikTok. You get a second job. You meditate. You journal. You grind. And when none of that works, you go quiet. You stop reaching out. You stop hoping. You stop trusting. You begin to believe you're the only one who's drowning. But you're not. This silence, the silence of shame, isn't natural. It's constructed. It's reinforced by a system that wants you to keep blaming yourself, instead of looking up, instead of asking hard questions, instead of building something better together. Because if we stop blaming ourselves, we might start blaming them, and that would be dangerous. This part of the story doesn't make headlines. Not really. There are no press conferences for the kind of slow, steady death that doesn't involve sirens or gunshots. No ribbon cuttings for cemeteries filling with working-class men in their 30s, 40s, 50s. No breaking news banners for the overdose in the trailer park, the suicide in a small town garage, the alcoholic collapse behind a gas station. It doesn't trend, it doesn't sell. It just accumulates in the obituaries, in the morgues, in the empty chairs at Thanksgiving. The data tells us what the news won't. Men, especially white working class men, are dying. Not in war, not in terrorist attacks, not in natural disasters, but from something quieter, something lonelier, from despair, opioids, alcohol, suicide, unaddressed trauma, unacknowledged mental illness. Each of these in its own is a public health crisis. Together, they form an invisible epidemic, what some researchers have called deaths of despair. Who doesn't know someone who's died of an overdose or a suicide? I do. These aren't random tragedies. They're symptoms of collapse, economic, social, emotional. Communities, once held together by union halls, church basements, bowling leagues, factory floors, and family wage jobs, have fractured. The institutions that gave people a sense of belonging have withered. The bonds of identity, purpose, and place have eroded. And in the vacuum left behind, isolation rushes in. It's not just that men are suffering. It's that they've been taught not to show it. From the time they're young, boys are given a narrow script. Be tough. Don't cry. Don't talk about it. Don't ask for help. Don't be weak. Don't be vulnerable. Don't be soft. Strength is stoicism. Pain is private. Emotions are suspect. And so, when men begin to break down, when the jobs disappear, when the marriage falls apart, when the bills mount, when the loneliness creeps in, they often suffer in silence because the world hasn't given them the tools or the permission to do anything else. Therapy is for the weak. Vulnerability is emasculating. Community is optional. And asking for help is admitting failure. So they isolate, they numb, they despair, sometimes into addiction, sometimes into rage, sometimes into the grave. And not all isolation is physical. Men who don't vanish in the real world begin to drift into digital ones. Online forums, YouTube rabbit holes, algorithmic echo chambers that offer a narrative to make sense of the pain. These spaces rarely offer healing, but they do offer explanations, and sometimes enemies. Here the language shifts from quiet despair to loud grievance. It's the feminists, it's the immigrants, it's the elite, it's the lefts, it's the government, it's the woke mob. It's everyone but you. What began as inward collapse is redirected outward as resentment, conspiracy, misogyny, radicalization. Some become trolls. Some become extremists. Some pick up weapons. Others just rot away behind screens, angry, addicted, and alone. We're quick to condemn these men when they lash out or shut down or give up. And in many cases, that condemnation is deserved. Hurt doesn't justify harm. But the conversation almost always stops at the behavior. We rarely ask, who set them up for this? Who sold them the myth that real men don't struggle? Who convinced them that their worth was tied to dominance, control, or self-reliance? Who dismantled the world they were promised and then told them it was their fault? These men didn't create the culture that broke them. They just inherited it. They were handed a script, told it was sacred, and then punished when it no longer worked. The system that told them they'd be providers made sure there were no jobs. The system that told them to be stoic gave them no language for grief. The system that told them they were superior made sure they were expendable. And so we arrive at the final irony. The system that demands strength from men leaves them too weak to ask for help. And the system that punishes their breakdown has no interest in preventing it. This is violence, not the spectacular kind that makes headlines, but the slow, bureaucratic, structural kind that doesn't make noise as it kills. The kind that closes factories and opens prisons. The kind that cuts mental health funding and expands police budgets. The kind that mocks men for being broken while giving them no tools to stay whole. And as a culture, we let it happen. Because acknowledging this violence would mean rethinking not just policy, but masculinity, identity, power, and worth. And that's a conversation we've been avoiding for generations. It's easy to mock the man shouting into the void, clinging to rugged individualism like it's a lifeline. The self-made myth, the bootstraps mantra, the lone wolf howl of "I don't need anyone." But what if it was a lifeline? What if, for a time, that belief was the only thing keeping his head above water? The sea didn't swallow him because he made poor choices. It swallowed him because the system that taught him to swim alone also removed the lifeguards, torched the rescue boats, and then blamed him for drowning. This is the cruel sleight of hand that defines the modern American experience for too many men. They feel told that masculinity meant stoicism, that control was power, that self-reliance was virtue. They were told that real men didn't ask for help, that needing others was weakness, that pain was meant to be buried, not voiced. But those messages were never just personal. They were institutional. They were reinforced in union halls where men were told they were providers, on factory floors where skill meant dignity, in wages that kept up with inflation and supported families, in civic spaces where identity was shared and community offered a sense of belonging. These weren't just abstract ideals. They were lived realities. They were the scaffolding that allowed individualism to function, a network of mutual support that enabled self-reliance without requiring isolation. And then the scaffolding was stripped away. Unions were kneecapped. Blue-collar jobs were offshored, automated, or dismantled. Pensions gave way to 401ks. Benefits became gig perks. Public space became privatized. Social fabric unraveled, and community shriveled under the weight of market logic. Now those same men are told to compete in a system that has no use for them, and to blame themselves when they lose. They internalize the failure. They try to hustle harder, grind longer, suppress more. And when that doesn't work, when the shame calcifies into silence, it turns inward, into addiction, into rage, into suicide. This isn't about excusing toxic masculinity or turning a blind eye to harm. This is about tracing the fracture back to its source. Because wounds don't heal if we don't understand where they came from. And people don't grow if they're still trying to live up to an ideal that was always designed to fail them. The betrayal wasn't just economic. It was spiritual, existential. The same system that taught men to define themselves by their ability to provide stripped away their means to do so. The same culture that told them to be strong gave them no room to be weak. The same society that told them to lead offered them no one to follow and no path forward. And then, when the weight of all the expectation collapsed into crisis, the system shrugged and called it personal responsibility. But personal responsibility doesn't explain mass trends. It doesn't explain why male suicide has become an epidemic. It doesn't explain why addiction, overdose, and isolation follow the same fault lines as deindustrialization. It doesn't explain why, when the jobs left, despair moved in. To understand the crisis of modern masculinity, we have to name the betrayal, not to wallow in it, not to excuse what some have done with that pain, but to chart a way forward that doesn't just pile new pressure on top of old wounds. You don't have to excuse a man's behavior to understand his breaking point. And if we want to build something new, something better, we have to start by recognizing just how many were never given the tools to survive in a world we handed them. Because they were set up to fail and told it was their fault when they did.